Great. Okay. Good afternoon, and welcome to the 22nd annual of Society for Brain Mapping and Therapeutics, focused on neurotech, pharmatech, cell tech, biotech, and medtech. We are live on YouTube, being viewed by millions of people. So today's keynotes focus on California Regenerative Medicine Institute, and which is a kind of a spin-off of a Proposition 14 of California, kind of a Prop 14. And Prop 14 was voted by the people of California to provide the funding for it. We are honored to have Dr. Jonathan Thomas with us, who's the CEO. But before that, I want Ms. Melissa King, who has been extremely active in the world of propositions for science and advocacy for science, to give an overview, kind of a very short overview of how the Prop 14 started in a few minutes. And then we're going to have Dr. Jonathan Thomas on stage. So, Melissa.
Thank you. It's great to be here. And I will be introducing Dr. Thomas to you. And he is someone who, in my world, similar to Dr. Kateb, really needs no introduction. So what I'll do is tell you a little bit about what he is doing for the world right now and for biomedical research. That is Dr. Thomas, by going back into history just a little bit and reminding us all that a little more than 20 years ago, there was an executive order in place that made it the case that in the United States, only a very small number of already existing embryonic stem cell lines could be used in research that was being funded by the NIH. This executive order was put in place in 2001. And the NIH, knock on all kinds of wood, for the time being remains the largest funder of medical research in the world, and it certainly was in 2001. And what that executive order did, while there were some existing lines that could be used in research, those lines, there weren't enough of them. They weren't all going to live forever. That's one of the things people will tell you about embryonic stem cells. They'll just live forever and you can keep reproducing them, but that's just not true with every line. And not only that, some of the lines were created on mouse feeder layers. They had all sorts of issues that really didn't lend themselves to the full breadth of the research that for which there was so much hope at this time, after these cells were first isolated in the late 90s by Jamie Thompson. So long story short, fast forward to 2003 in California, here where we are today, and a group of parents of kids with diabetes got together and said we should get stem cell research funded at the state level here in California. We have all of these world-class institutions here. Let's do this. So they tried to get something through the legislature, and that was very difficult at that time. The legislature in California at that time was protracted. Imagine that. So in what they ended up doing without being able to get something through the legislature, which, by the way, if you know anything about state legislatures, even in a large state like California, probably that would have yielded perhaps a few $1 million a year in research funding. And instead, a group got together after that and said, okay, we'll do a ballot initiative. And they went to a gentleman, Bob Klein, very well known to Dr. Kateb, to Dr. Thomas, to Evan Schneider, Dr. Schneider up here in the front row, and I. And Bob also had a child with diabetes, had helped the JDRF, Juvenile Diabetes Research Foundation at the time, they've rebranded as JDRF, get a lot of funding in Washington, a few $1 billion of funding. So they went to Bob and said, Bob can be the rainmaker, and he was, and he had an amazing vision. And in 2004, we got a ballot initiative passed here in California, 60% of the vote, which is pretty good for a ballot initiative, and we got an initial $3 billion in funding, very different than $3 million. and we created the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. So kind of like having a mini NIH, although I don't like that analogy because it's really focused on regenerative medicine and stem cells and now also gene therapy and other related research. And we've had that in California at this point, I'm proud to say, for 20 years. I worked on that campaign. I hired the first 10 people at the agency, including myself, because I was one of the few people on the campaign with actual work experience, so they drafted me for that. And I had a front seat at the table, taking the first board through 1,500 hours of public meetings. When that first turn of the board was done after 6 years, 2011, I'm leaving CIRM, going to business school, we got an amazing second chair of the board. And that gentleman was Dr. Jonathan Thomas. And then he served as the chair of CIRM for 12 years. And then he transitioned off. He left willingly, imagine that. But the board, the newly constituted board, had the wisdom when they were looking for a new president, because the woman that had been president for a number of years at that time, it was her time to move on and do something else, maybe go back to biotech. They had the wisdom to hire him as the president of the agency. Excellent choice. He knows the place very well and is now serving since 2024 as the president of CIRM. And so that's a little bit of a history of where we've been in California with this funding and a little bit of his background. Of course, he's done some other things in his life, but I think what he's here to talk to you about today is largely related to his work at CIRM and the work that we have all done together with supporters like Dr. Kateb and Dr. Snyder from the very beginning. Thank you. Dr. Thomas.
Good afternoon, everybody. And Melissa, thank you for that very nice introduction. I do want to note that Melissa was a bit downplaying her role. When she started full-time at CIRM after the election, she was Bob Klein's right-hand person and indispensable to the agency's effort to get up and running from scratch, which, considering there was nothing like CIRM anywhere in the country in 2004, and by the way, that still remains the case, she did a fantastic job in helping to form the agency and tee it up for what it is now. So Melissa, thank you very much for all of your work. Let's give a round of applause for. Should say that was a nice introduction. I had the privilege of giving a few speeches. Some introductions are more substantive than others. We had a big convocation of our students from a variety of our education programs at USC last year, which was a great conference. And there was the keynote speaker to that was one of our great affiliated stem cell experts from Baylor University School of Medicine, who at the very last minute was unable to make it to the conference. And so 5 minutes before her keynote, somebody asked me if I would step in and give the keynote speech, which I said, sure, be happy to. And one of the sort of collateral issues was the person introducing me had no idea who I was and introduced me as, well, our next speaker, I'm not really sure who it is, so you'll have to introduce himself. So that was interesting. Anyway, so speaking to all of you right now at a very critical time in the healthcare research world, I needn't point out what's happening back east and the uncertainties that are created right now in terms of funding for critical medical research that's going to enable the country to continue what it's done in its position of superiority in medical research in the world, and it threatens a lot of progress. It obviously all remains to be seen how it plays out over the next few months, but the early returns are it's creating a bit of confusion and real concern amongst many entities. Evan, I know it, can certainly speak for yours. I'm sure you'll talk about this later. This is one of our preeminent stem cell scientists in California, the aforementioned Dr. Evan Snyder from UCSD, who you'll hear from a little bit later on. So CIRM is a funding entity, so we're the bank, okay? So we were set up, we were enabled with $3 billion of state general obligation bond funds to give out for grants and loans to academic institutions, research institutions, and biotech companies that are in the stem cell field as of 2004. Now, for those of you who, most of you probably aren't totally on top of where stem cells were at that time, the first human embryonic stem cell wasn't identified till 1998. So the field really started at the turn of the century, and as of 2004 was very much in fledgling form and needed a lot of guidance and a lot of seed funding and a lot of training and a lot of other things that get a whole new area of medicine going. We had just finished a couple of eras. If you went back decades before that, the small molecules business was generated. Then in the 90s, you had monoclonal antibodies, 80s and 90s, that were a brand new thing. And they took several decades to get up and going. And then in the early 2000s, stem cells were, to quote Silicon Valley's Jim Clark, if you recall who he is, coined the term the new thing, and that's what stem cells were in that period of time. So in 2004, in the face of federal funding blocks that Melissa described, CIRM began putting money out to fund stem cell research. And in those days, that involved a lot of small grants to seed research. It involved a lot of money to entities to build stem cell institutes. If you go over to Keck School of Medicine, for example, you'll see USC has the Eli and Edie Broad Stem Cell Institute, a separate standing building devoted strictly to stem cell research. Similarly, there are areas of UCLA that were funded to transform into stem cell research facilities, likewise at Cedars, likewise at City of Hope, and so on throughout the state of California. So when this funding really got going, which, by the way, nothing happens without litigation. So when CIRM passed in November of 2004, when that ballot measure passed, there were 2 years of litigation that followed as to whether that was a constitutionally prohibited ballot measure or not. CIRM won on all counts in the state Supreme Court, and they started funding in 2006. So with that set off now a period of we hit our 20th anniversary last year, and over that period of time, we've funded now over 1,400 grants in the full spectrum of research from discovery all the way up through phase 3 clinical trials. We have separate programs for discovery, translation, and the clinical phase. And these grants have now funded everything from the most rare to the most prevalent diseases affecting Californians. Very importantly, the money has to go to entities that have a nexus to California because bonds are issued that taxpayers pay the debt on. So this is the responsibility to wisely deploy the money for California purposes. Now, throughout this 20 years, the field, of course, has grown. And there have been a number of sort of milestone developments that have changed the field dramatically. You'll recall, or either at the time or you studied, depending on your age, the development in 2007 of something called induced pluripotent stem cells, which were remarkable thing and a wild concept at the time. A doctor who split his time between the University of Kyoto and the Gladstone Institute in San Francisco posited the question, if you had an adult cell, could you reverse engineer it back to essentially embryonic stage? Why he would think to even ask that question is one thing, and how he would go about doing it, let alone asking the question, was another. But indeed he did, and he came up with a combination of 4 proteins that if you take a blood cell or a skin cell and you expose it to these proteins, it reverse engineers those cells back to pluripotent stage to become anything in the body, just as embryonic stem cells are. And then you could take those induced pluripotent stem cells and expose them to further proteins to differentiate into neurons or blood or your nose or whatever you happen to do. For that, he was given the Nobel Prize about 5 years later. Evan, I don't know if you ever heard this story. This is a pretty funny story as an aside. So Shinya Yamanaka, Nobel Prize winner, is in the University of Kyoto the day he gets the award. And he is on Skype, for those of you who remember Skype, with Deepak Srivastava, who runs the Gladstone Institute, who's interviewing him about what's it like to get a Nobel Prize, because you don't frequently deal with people you know firsthand and get to hear the stories. So he's looking up at Shinya on the screen. He says, so what was it like when you got the call? And he says, well, he said, I was on my back on the floor cleaning out our dishwasher, and my wife picks up the phone and says, honey, it's somebody calling from Sweden. So I got on the phone, told me I won the award. I thanked him very much, hung up the phone, and went back to cleaning my dishwasher, which is, if you happen to know Shinya, is extremely modest guy. Anyway, so that discovery transformed stem cell research, particularly in the neurological field, because if you're trying to figure out drugs that affect all these terrible neurological conditions, which are the central focus of this conference, you can't just give patients lots of drugs and see what happens. The FDA won't allow that. So how do you know which drugs are most promising? Well, you take somebody who's got Parkinson's and you take their adult stem cell, their adult cell, skin sample, for example. You go through the process, you reverse engineer back to pluripotent stage, you then differentiate into neurons. So now you've got that person's Parkinson's in a dish in front of you that has all the characteristics of that particular person's condition. Then you can do high throughput drug screening against these neurons sitting there in the dish, and that will enable you to see which drugs have a material impact on the progression of the disease in the dish. And once you discover that, then you can test that in clinical trials once you get FDA clearance to start that process. So there was that big development. The second big development came about 5 years later, which was the discovery of CRISPR and gene editing, which was a combination of doctors Doudna at Berkeley and Charpentier in France, who also got the Nobel Prize for figuring out gene editing. And that has opened up an entirely new world of treatments to be developed for genes that have mutations that you can actually edit out and replace with the appropriate correct amino acid sequences so that they perform as they're supposed to. Lots of research has been done using CRISPR. Some of you are probably in labs that use CRISPR. But in any event, throughout all of this, CIRM has adapted as these new things come along, and our programs that we've funded over the years have grown in scope to mirror what these new developments are. We ran through our $3 billion in 2020, so as Melissa said, we had to go back on the ballot, got an additional $5.5. So we're now an $8.5 billion state agency that not only funds the research, but it funds, as I mentioned, education programs. This is a pretty amazing number. We put out, I think now, over $400 million over 20 years devoted to programs at either high schools, colleges, the postdoc level, and beyond to generate California's workforce in this increasingly vibrant field of stem cell and now, courtesy of Prop 14, gene therapy research. So CIRM funds both of those going forward. And indeed, many of the programs that we fund that are furthest along are actually in the gene therapy space because dealing with gene mutations that are either individual or very few in number, creating a very clear target to try to develop technologies for either therapies or cures is in many instances a lot easier than some of the other conditions that have multiple mutations and are a little bit less further along. In addition to the education programs, we also, as I mentioned, have these centers that we built at which now we have trial facilities for patients who want to come to get soup to nuts treatment in the clinical trials that CIRM funds, as well as many others outside of CIRM funds. So we have 9 of these. We call them alpha clinics spread throughout the state. And they've had well over 2,000 patients now who've gone through these clinical trials, and that number increases every year. So we have those, we call that part of our infrastructure program. Those 9 stem cell alpha clinics are at our major medical institutions. There are lots of areas in the state, obviously, that don't have major medical institutions. So we're adding now a number of satellite facilities to deliver treatments that are developed at the major institutions, which we're calling community care centers of excellence that'll be spread throughout the state. So we'll have an increasingly large ability for patients to access these clinical trials. The patients are at base, of course, what we're all about. Everything is driven by what they need, what we can do to help them, what we can do to facilitate the research at the various institutions and biotech companies in the space. And indeed, patients were critical, as Melissa will tell you, to the passage of the 2 initiatives because they got squarely behind the initiatives, were very involved in spreading the gospel on what the initiatives were all about, and extremely central to the passage of both, which of course we were extremely grateful for, and we in turn paid that back by doing everything we can to help patients of every condition you can possibly imagine. So if you look at CIRM today, it's very vibrant. We just went through last year, we're down to our quote-unquote last $3.8 billion under Prop 14, and we figured that demand is picking up for our grants, so we needed to, and this is before all of everything that's happened the last 6 weeks, we needed to prioritize how we were going to spend that money, so we spent a big chunk of last year doing that. We now have a new version of CIRM that we're going to be rolling out this year that takes into account this reprioritization and will be the basis for funding grants in all the areas we've talked about going forward. I should point out an interesting fact that roughly 50% of our portfolio now is in rare disease, which you may not have been aware of. And we assume going forward that that percentage is going to roughly continue as there is a never-ending need. There are so many different rare diseases that are terrible that we will be very much as involved as we always have been. So I think the message is, whereas we don't know what's going to happen in Washington, we do know what's going to happen here. We're continuing apace. We gave out $100 million in grants last month, or I guess now January, now that we're into March, and we'll continue along doing everything we've been doing to ensure that we get as much funding as we possibly can out to cure all of these diseases that are the scourge of humanity. So with that, Bob Beck wanted me to sort of give 20, 25 minutes worth. I think that brings you up to date on where we are, and I think he said if there's any Q&A, be happy to answer anybody's questions.
Any questions from the audience? Well, I have some questions, if you don't mind. Is this fund, let's say there is a company in Australia and we want to write a grant together with a company in California. Is this possible to get the funding and subcontractor to them or vice versa?
So in order to, excuse me, sorry, too much talking. In order to do something like that, you need a nexus to California. So if, for example, apologize, if, for example, a company is involved in clinical trials and has, let's say, one of their clinical trial sites is at UCLA, even though they're Australian, they can apply to California for funding for that component of whatever they're doing that has that California nexus. But if there is no California nexus, then that won't work, because again, we're responsible to the taxpayers, and so everything has to have that connection.
And that goes across the states as well? So let's say from New Jersey to here. Let's say Cellularity wants to work with Aramis Therapeutics. So we are California-based, and we want to basically, you have an IND open for brain cancer. You have, IND open for MS. So, but we want to collaborate with them to bring that to California. So how does that work? And do we need to have a collateral, meaning that the grant, in the past CERM would say if the two companies or two organizations are sending grants, there should be a collateral. Is this still the case? Let's say the clinical trial costs $5 million, and can we request the entire amount, or the company has to show a certain amount to get the $5 million?
Anybody, that company or whomever that applies has to have whatever it is they're asking for, has to be the work being done in California. Mm-hmm. So it's whether it's...
But the full amount can be paid, right? So let's say if I'm asking for $5 million, we don't have to have a $5 million or a $3 million collateral. In the past, I think that was the case. I'm not sure.
Yeah, I'm not sure I'm totally following that question, but if, again, let's say there's a $5 million ask and $2 million of that's getting done in California, the $2 million is eligible, and you'd have to co-fund the remaining $3 million because that connection doesn't exist for the rest of the work.
Okay. All right.
Hope that's helpful.
Fantastic. And I know the Proposition 14 had $1.5 billion for neuroscience. Am I correct?
That's correct.
And how does that being kind of allocated or being looked at?
So we spent a great deal of time looking at this. Interestingly enough, historically, 30%, give or take, of our awards have always gone out to neuro. So whether it's brain-related or the CNS. And already since Prop 14, I think we're at 33% of the Prop 14 funds have been spent thus far on neuro, which is higher than the ratio of 1.5 to 5.5. So we don't anticipate there's going to be any issue whatsoever with expending the requisite amount per the proposition in neurological related conditions. Now, having said that, we're giving a lot of emphasis in-house in reviewing our portfolio and determining where funds would be best spent, and that'll involve a review of what we have in the neuro portfolio going forward. But in terms of meeting that goal of at least 1.5, we're well on to, and if we continue, exceeding that amount.
I'm sorry, final question. How organization like us can propose a new type of grant or kind of consortium approach to solving neurological disorders using cell therapy or with CERM? I mean, can we propose or send some sort of a recommendation?
So I think if you have an interest in applying for something, the sort of the standard technique is you begin by discussing with one of the science officers who is involved in either, whatever stage this research is at, discovery, translational, or clinical, and talk through what the process is of submitting an application, what goes into it, what gives you the best shot of getting approved, remembering that at the end of the day, an entirely separate peer review group does the analysis and recommendation on it. So, and we don't influence them. They're entirely arm's length. They propose to the board who should be funded. The board makes the final decision. But if you want to do something like that, the first step is to talk to one of the science officers, and if you have something you want to talk about, let me know and I'll turn you over to the right person.
Congrats on all of the progress. This is really an exciting effort that I'm thrilled to see California leading. My question is, I guess, about the sphere of, I guess, activity. So on review of the website and listening to your talk, it's very stem cell focused, but it also does seem to encapsulate beyond stem cells with some other kind of regenerative medicine, yes or no. So I guess if you imagine a company, I guess my question more specifically as an example could be, if a company is developing, let's say, a therapeutic that is thought to have potential regenerative properties that's not stem cell based, like for ALS or something like that, is that within the realm of CERM's interest, or is it really more strictly along the lines of stem cell therapy?
So there are different ways of approaching stem cells. There's stem cells themselves as therapeutics, and then there are other things that can impact stem cells, which are curative or treatments by themselves. So there has to be some connection to stem cells or gene therapy, and if there isn't any, then that's going to make it very difficult to meet eligibility requirements to apply for the grants.
That's really helpful, and I would presume that also includes tools, which the website did seem to have, such as I need a better, or I need to activate. There are stem cell models, for example, of ALS, and they're uniformly problematic, not great, and they have mixed reviews. So, a project that would be using, stem cells for that purpose, for therapeutic, I guess, assessment of target engagement, seems like that would fall into the category?
It certainly arguably would, yes.
Cool, thank you very much.
Yeah.
I got a quick question too. Thank you very much for your talk. It was really, congratulations on all the funds that you have. So I'm Abi Haridas, president of Sbmt. I am a practicing neurosurgeon, and so when I heard your talk, my mind went to translational immediately. That's where my strength is. So my question is twofold. There's many colleagues of mine who are neurosurgeons in the audience, but we're not basic scientists, right? So that's number one. So for someone like me who is independent and private, and also people that are affiliated with universities, what are some of the obstacles for physicians who are on the ground taking care of these patients? What are some of the obstacles they should get out of the way before they approach you for grant funding? Like some of the things you just have to kind of, prerequisites, I should say, that you've seen in your career.
Sorry, I'm not entirely sure I'm following that. Is the question, is this a research-related question, or is this a use of products question?
Use of products, yeah. So for example, I'll give you an example. Spinal cord injury, Person falls down, has a, like a Christopher Reeve kind of incident, spinal cord injury. Now we want to devise something that we can put on the spinal cord at the time of surgery. That is my idea. So do I approach you? Do I approach a biotech tech company? Like it's a big idea for a big problem, but being a single surgeon, it's something that we kind of think about all the time. So do you have something in CERN specifically for surgeons that want to kind of explore these things, or even other physicians that are directly taking care of patients?
So we're not a medical device funding entity. For example, we wouldn't have a request for application for medical devices to treat patients that are involved in stem cell therapy. And I think that your best bet would be to figure out which companies are involved in the development of that sort of product and start a dialogue with them. Because if you have a sort of a revolutionary idea on a new device that can be used to implement stem cell treatments or whatever, I think that somebody like that would be all ears to hear you out and to help you figure out what to do going forward.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Marcos Wagner from Brazil, and I'm a neurosurgeon also, and we as neurosurgeon, we have to have solutions for intra-op, and it's a good idea for you to be connected with some company devices because, for example, for nerve regeneration, as in diabetes and so on, do you have any idea about that?
Okay, could you just repeat that one more time?
Yes, for nerve repair, do you have some ideas about it or any solutions?
So we have a number of our projects that we're funding are involved in neurodegeneration and neuroregeneration. So if your question is anything sort of made it to the finish line for that sort of thing, Evan, I'll ask you that question. Are you aware of anything? Yeah, I mean, it's the neuro field's a very challenging field. I don't need to tell anybody here that, and that if there are parts of stem cell work that's further along, because it's to the extent you could ever say anything in the field is lower hanging fruit. I mean, everything's a tremendous challenge, but some things are easier to try to get research at than others, and the neuro field's one of the toughest for a variety of reasons. And so if the question of is there a product out there that now definitively regenerates nerves, not that I know of, but we are funding projects that are involved in that, and if you'd be interested, you should just check out, by the way, this is our hot off the press new website, serms.ca.gov. Welcome all of you to take a look at this. It's got tons of information in it and is worth looking into for a variety of reasons, but particularly if you're looking to see if you qualify for research for things that we fund. It's all in there, and I think our team has done a very nice job of updating it to make it as user-friendly as possible. Other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
All right, so we're going to have a short panel. Dr. Evan Steiner, please join us. Dr. Kuldeep Sidhu from Australia. And yes, Melissa, please join us. Also, Vicky, please join us. Dr. Yamamoto. Yeah, fabulous, right? Okay. I can sit here. Vicky gonna sit there. All right. All right, so gonna have about 10-15 minutes, kind of a rapid fire kind of panel today. John, thank you very much for your amazing presentation. So another round of applause for John, who's also my neighbor. Thanks for coming. It's good to have neighbors in our power places. So, Melissa, please, well, you don't have, I mean, you don't need any introduction, but please go ahead, introduce yourself very quickly. So,
You already heard from me a little bit in the introduction to John and to Sbmt, to Dr. Thomas and to Sbmt. Now I am focused on HealthSpan and building a global coalition around the notion of HealthSpan. I'd love to talk to any of you interested about joining the HealthSpan Action Coalition. And the other thing I wanted to say, just in response to some of the questions that we heard directed at Dr. Thomas, as you probably have surmised, Sbmt is a state funding agency that was created via a ballot initiative, which means that the rules around it are by statute. So you're definitely welcome, as Dr. Thomas was saying, to look for potential partners that might be able to apply for a Sbmt grant, or maybe you could apply as a group. But you know, the rules are set by statute. It funds what it funds. We'd love to be able to fund everything. But I think and actually to Dr. Kateb's question as well, in the past we have funded partnerships. Sbmt has funded partnerships in many different ways, and you just have to be on the lookout. If you're interested in seeking Sbmt funding, you have to be on the lookout for what their RFPs are about and or interface with their science staff to figure out if there is a way. You may think that there isn't, but maybe there is. So I encourage you to look into that, especially in the climate we're in right now. I encourage you to look into it.
fabulous. Go ahead. You have to hold it.
I'll hold it down, okay. So I'm Evan Snyder. Obviously, I'm a stem cell biologist, but I'm also pediatrician, child neurologist, and a neonatologist. So my science has always been driven by looking at the kids in front of me and what can we do to help them. But I should also say that, and many of you may experience this, I'm a true advocate of not only bench to bedside, but bedside to bench, meaning it's the kids and their diseases and what goes on with them that informed most of my biology longer ago than I want to admit. But I was in Boston for many, many years at Boston Children's Hospital, Harvard Medical School. And in fact, as JT alluded to, 98 was an amazing year for the stem cell field. Jamie Thomas isolated the first human embryonic stem cells. We actually isolated the first human neural stem cells. Rusty Gage demonstrated that there was such a thing as human adult neurogenesis. And everything looked to be exciting and ahead of us. And then, of course, in 2000, the Bush administration came in. And it looked as if it would be, the curtain would be rung down on all this kind of excitement. And I can tell you, back on the East Coast, we were beside ourselves. Even the most forward-looking university had no idea how we were going to handle this. And that included Harvard. You know, we knew that we couldn't let this grind to a halt, but we weren't exactly sure. Some of you may not even remember, but there was a chance that using stem cells, and ours actually came from a fetus, obviously human embryonic stem cells came from byproducts of IVF. There was even a chance that it could be criminalized, that if you use them, you could go to jail, that your institution could be fined or shut down. And despite the fact that I said, I'm never, ever leaving Boston, here was California, and brave and brazen and with true attitude. And I'm not sure if you guys remember this, but Deborah Ortiz, a state legislator, passed, uh, uh, passed a bill that made California a safe haven for stem cell research. Didn't have funding with it, but it said, you will not go to jail. In fact, we want you to embrace that. And the institutions in California seized on that and started attracting stem cell biologists to build up the infrastructure in California. And then, of course, as we got here, we all hooked up with Bob Klein to actually get some money behind that. So California, that was Prop 71, and it was fun. It was fun campaigning. It was fun not having to worry about whether you would be shut down for legal reasons, but to explore all of the possibilities. Prop 71 passed, and I think California truly became a leader in regenerative medicine, every aspect of it. And as the field became more and more sophisticated, JT talked about this notion of cancer stem cells and of IPS lines and of plasticity and genome editing. CIRM followed that all along and was quite nimble and quite responsive. And I think it's fair to say that we probably in California are the leaders at the forefront of every aspect of regenerative medicine. There's nothing like us. Now, and then, after the Bush administration kind of receded, we had Obama. We had a little interlude of Trump, but he really didn't have his act together there. And then we had Biden. We flourished and maybe became a little bit complacent, just focusing on our science and not so much the politics anymore. Well, I think it's probably time now for all scientists and physicians to really step up to the plate and have their voice heard, because, and I know CIRM and I know California is going to be right there waving the flag. Now we have people in DC that consult data, don't know how to interpret data, insert false data, that is going to be even worse probably than what was going on with just maybe what they may have thought of as a niche field of stem cells coming to a halt. What's going on now could actually, and I think if you see what's going on in Texas, impact the lives, the lives of kids and of adults. So I think everybody in this room, and I know we in regenerative medicine at CIRM, are finding this to be both challenging but invigorating, because at the same time as this happening, the science is just astounding. We've become so much more sophisticated. I really do feel, and I don't say this lightly, that we are on the verge of making a true impact on some horrible diseases that are afflicting the world.
Great comment. Okay, we go to Dr. Yamamoto. Quick introduction and some comments about role of stem cell therapy in cancer, or anyone. Yeah. You're a former fellow of CIRM, actually. Vicky is a CIRM fellow.
Hello, hi, I'm Vicky Yamamoto. I'm actually currently one of our founder of the Society for Brain Mapping and Therapeutics. But at the same time, I'm currently working as a cancer researcher at the USC Keck School of Medicine. And so yeah, as he said, I'm actually one who actually got the most benefit out of a CIRM program. I was actually a CIRM fellow when I was a PhD student. So I really appreciate the organization. So my comment about it, so as you can probably see, if you are from California or if you are a visitor outside of states and then come to California, you can see that people in California are really relatively progressive side. So while just like Dr. Snyder said that in the previous, let's say Bush administration, for instance, some administration may stop, the study or research using stem cell really actually, I feel that, that type of, policy really slow down the progress of research. But while, having such a limitation, California, I think at the time it was governor was Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was a Republican. I think that, this will probably, make us, slow and late in the discovery of research. And that's where, CERN and also, California really supported Proposition 71. And after 10 years, when the funding ran out, we proposed another one, Proposition 14. The first Proposition 71 was mainly to try to basically, my understanding is that to try to study what is the stem cell, how does stem cell behave, and very basic science. But in the new Proposition 14, if you look at the policy carefully, now because of Proposition 71, we accumulate enough basic finding about the stem cell. Now at the Proposition 14, we are in the process of translate the finding into more like a small animal study to clinical research. So we really I feel that California, as a Californian, we feel very privileged, and we appreciate having such an initiative, and especially for the help from the CERN.
Fantastic. All right. Yeah, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Babak, allowing me to share this forum with the outstanding people like John, Melissa, and Snyder, Vicky. My journey is very interesting. I'm a professor back in Faculty of Medicine with focus on neurodegenerative diseases, particularly Alzheimer. Probably you all are aware of that there is a latency of 10 to 15 years before the Alzheimer shows a symptom. And we use stem cell to early diagnose the onset of the disease in the petri dish. So it's a long journey, but the point I want to make is that in year 1998, when Jamie Thompson produced the first human ESC cell, in 1998 he published, I was in his lab 1999. And I learned from him, took that technology back to Australia, and set up my own lab to create human embryonic stem cell line. The interesting part, when I knew what I wanted to do, and when I went back to Australia, there was no legislation in place. Australia didn't have any legislation to do stem cell research. 3 years I spent in the lower house, upper house, to educate the legislator that this is the prime time that Australia should, along with all my colleagues, we got 2 legislation in place in 2002. And my lab was the first one to apply for a license, NHMRC.
That's a good one.
So we applied for the license to NHMRC, and we got it. And then question was, as you know, you have to have an access to the embryo. So we sign up with the big IVF company, and I got an access to 100 embryos. And I produced the Australia first xeno-free and serum-free human ESL line, Endeavour 1 and Endeavour 2. So that's my journey. And down the track, the issue of using human ESL continued to be controversial, and I respect that. And then came Shinya Yamanaka, who created that you can retro-engineer cell using your adult stem cell to the same state. And I got a very special privilege again to work with him in an international consortium. So my lab and my cell was associated with him, looking at quality control of stem cell with the Shinya Yamanaka. We published in Nature Biotechnology together. And I adopted IPS technology from his platform, and to the extent that I thought this is the technology we need to take to the next level. So we created about 50 different clones from patient with Alzheimer, both familial and sporadic cases, including sex and age control. And we were very proud of having access to the biobank of this cell line. And we could diagnose. As I said before, there is a latency of 10 to 15 years. And in the Petri dish, we created those forebrain using iPS cell from these patients. And we can stipulate in vitro in a matter of 4 weeks to find out whether these cells can create that kind of environment in vitro. We could actually assess the onset of the disease in the Petri dish. But the question, I think, comes down to, I mean, those who are in the stem cell field would know the cost of producing even a single iPS cell line or human ES cell line is very expensive. So in US, 40,000. In Australia, say for example, we say it's $25,000. So to create a platform and then miniaturize for the use by the patient is a very expensive proposition and translation. So that's my journey in terms of the stem cell. But the other point, because I'm sharing with John, I just want to bring to the notice of Sir. We gave you Alan Townsend anyway, so he was with you for a long time. One of the issues which I think in a regenerative medicine field, we are not prime time at the moment, right? We are still not. Reason being, there are ethical issues, and we don't know how the living cell interact with the human body. And the third, which is the most critical, which I think I get criticized if I raise that issue, is who is the elephant in the room. So it's not the SERM, it's not WHO, it's not NIH, it's not NHMRC. It is something else. When we are in a regenerative medicine, we are talking about cure rather than treatment. And the big pharma don't like us. And that's why, and these are the people who regulate the translation. So they are the helm of affair in clinical trial, every aspect of drug development, whatever the kind of drug developments are there. So that is the elephant in the room, and if we address that, probably this field will go much faster down the track than it is at the moment. Thank you.
Fabulous. Yeah, actually, Dr. Sidhu was our 11th president. We are now 22nd, going to 23rd. So in 2014, we had a World Congress for Brain Mapping in Sydney, Australia. And it was 2016, we were speaking at your parliament.
Yeah.
So we spoke at the parliament and educate policymakers. And so, so it's very important to educate policymakers. I'm with you on that one. So we are getting very close to the start of the next sessions, parallel sessions. So just final thoughts from our friend JT.
So I would just say that as far as the stem cell and gene therapy field goes, as Evan suggested, the science is inexorably advancing at an accelerated pace. The work that's being done, not just in California, but throughout the country and the world is phenomenal. And none of us here at the table have any doubt but that we're going to be seeing in the coming years, and not that too far out, the start of a wave of therapies and cures arising from this research. And those of you who are involved in it, I think this is a true golden era of medical research and discovery that we'll all look back on down the road as saying this is a time when collectively we really did a tremendous job in advancing medicine for the benefit of patients all over the world. So it's a privilege for me to be able to speak to you guys, and I applaud everything that you're doing because it's critically important, and keep up the great work. Thanks, Bob.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. So basically, we conclude the panel, and you can start the general sessions. Thank you.